already being replaced every 4 or 5 years, which is generally the replacement cycle that we see with municipal police departments.
Well, I know the way, I've been around for a while and I've owned cars since the 1970s, and they used to be junk. Things wouldn't last 100,000 miles, and now you can drive them 300,000 miles. So replacing them every 2 years, I always thought wasn't a prudent use of the taxpayers' money, but if it ends up being every 5 years, we'll save a lot of money on it.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Gary. We're going to move on. Thank you, Gary. And the next item on our agenda is the 5-year capital improvement program. Tom's forwarding to the slides here. And as was noted in Director Watson's memo, the 5-year CIP is required to come before the council as part of the budget development process in connection with the financial policies that were recently updated and approved earlier this year by the Common Council. The 5-year CIP is based on input received from all of the various departments that have capital needs, and not only encompasses general capital projects, but also the capital needs of the sewer and the water utilities, which are also budgets approved by this body. As noted in the CIP plan that was included in tonight's meeting binder, each project listed in the CIP includes a narrative and a justification for why it's included in 1 year or many years within the 5-year time frame. This year, the total amount requested for 2019 is $20 million. You'll recall we approved the contract for the East Trunk Sewer project earlier this year, and that is going to be hitting us next year, Tom, in terms of debt service?
Yes.
So that'll be accounted, the payment.
We've already started repaying in 2018.
Okay. But that'll be reflected in 2019. 16.7 million is to be financed, as noted on the slide, through debt issuance. The other 2.2 million within the CIP is typically funded through the tax levy and is a component of the operating budget and is really the capital list or the capital requests that this body reviews and ultimately approves in connection with your role as the Appropriations Committee. Again, $2.2 million were requested by the operating departments this year. We're going to show you a slide in a couple of moments that indicate we're funding at about 50% of that level, and we'll kind of walk you through where those dollars are going to be allocated. Despite that, we've had a lot of success, really, in the last several years relative to capital investment here in the city of Mequon. And you heard some requests from members of the community earlier tonight, but I think it's important to remember we've done more than $6 million worth of roads in the last 4 years, and we've moved our road maintenance out of future debt issues, as I mentioned earlier. We built the $9 million combined facility for DPW, and we've reduced the number of facilities that we are now responsible for managing and upkeeping from 11 to 8. We've converted our patrol fleet to all SUVs for the police department, and we've taken delivery of a new pumper squad and an ambulance within the last couple of years. Director Lundeen has worked with her department to establish capital improvement plans for our drainage needs, as well as our sewer and water utilities. We saved $1.25 million through our water bond refunding last year to the benefit of our water utility customers. Through that process and this year's borrowing for the East Trunk Sewer, we've upped our bond ratings to AA, and as mentioned, the East Trunk Sewer project is now underway. That's going to be a huge benefit to Southeast Mequon and all the residents that live there. So we haven't been just sitting around doing nothing. We've been doing a lot. That's millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of investment here in Mequon, and the Common Council should be applauded for that approach and a lot of the tangible results that we're seeing on the capital side. To build on that, what we've been doing here tonight and at our last workshop meeting is taking a data-driven approach to some of our other capital needs across our other major asset classes, facilities, fleet, and infrastructure in particular. And over the last 18 months, year and a half, we've been working to establish that asset management plan as part of a business approach to effectively managing these assets over the long term, the 10 to 20-year lifespans that we've seen as part of these studies. It involves both a qualitative and quantitative analysis. How are we doing things? Are we doing enough? And we're really being strategic in how we go about these particular studies because we're measuring our needs, we're distilling the data and figuring out what we can afford and what really needs to be done through prioritization and other exercises, and then we're acting or deciding whether or not to make additional expenditures on those identified needs. We're not just throwing money at the problem because we've got people coming up and saying they need money. We're studying the problem first, and then as a group coming together and developing consensus on what's the best overall strategic approach long-term relative to any one particular asset class. The 3 studies that we've completed to date have run us $55,000. The fleet study cost us some money to bring in the consulting firm as well as the facilities. We did the right-of-way infrastructure analysis in-house. And to the point that was, or the points that were raised earlier by members of the audience, there's going to be $40,000 included in the draft operating budget that you'll see next week to complete that park and open space plan update, which is another plan that will give you data and information to help decide what the long-term capital spending needs and requirements and decisions will be relative to our parks and our open space.
They're asking for 50, why is 40?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Well, we're preparing a budget that's not going to have any increase in the tax rate, which means we need to balance a lot of different needs, and there's room for some new spending, but not unlimited new spending. $40,000 was what we could afford within the draft budget.
I'd personally like to see that up to 50. Just that's one opinion that'll come up when you get budget, and there'll be heavy discussion on my part. Okay. That's been not funded or underfunded for too many years, and the minimum of just doing a study so that they can analyze the facilities and then gain fundraising capabilities within the different parks to improve the parks at no cost to the city. I mean, we're just cutting costs to not let them do their job. It's not going to nothing, it's going to a really good purpose, and I'm very confident that the Park and Open Space Committee is going to work really hard to make sure those funds are not only spent appropriately, but really look at ways to gain for the city over the long term. So, you know, I'll be a big proponent of seeing that number up to 50, which is a number that they're requesting. I'm sure that number was a conservative number. They have a lot more needs beyond the 50,000 that's in that budget request.
Can you put this out for an RFP? I mean, usually we put stuff out for an RFP.
We will.
What's that?
We will.
Yeah, where does either number come from?
Yeah, where the 50,000 come from? I'd like to see it in an RFP and find out what the real cost would be.
The original number that was being bantered around was higher than that. They cut it back to be more palatable. There isn't a scope of work written yet, so you can't put it out for RFP. We need to budget it.
Yeah, but do they have a basis for any of those numbers?
That's experience.
The original request was between 100 and 150 to do a comprehensive visionary study. After we went through some discussion, the consensus was based on historical pricing to just update the plan, which doesn't really redo a whole lot. It just goes through what if the last round of plans was accomplished, what still needs to be done. That's typically been around 30,000. And so the thought was, with the inclusion of the mini master plans, a potential review of the park impact fee and other add-ons, that we would go to RFP and we would do as an a la carte, so that ideally at a minimum we're getting the comprehensive park plan update, but that there are options of add-ons for these mini master plans, as they're calling them, for the community parks, a review of the park impact fee and other things that we would be able to select from that list, which would come before the Common Council for contract award.
I think if you set the number at 50, what you'll get in reality is the comprehensive plan for all the park and open space, and one, maybe two of the mini master plans. You won't get all three that they're hoping to get done. They want to get a start. I think the 100 to 150 was if we did master plans for all the parks, and we quickly backtracked to just the 3 most heavily used, actively used parks.
We're also looking for a study like the intent behind these other asset management plans that's smart, so it has measurable goals, specific things with actual dollars, so that when they come in the future to advocate, whether that's with private entities for funding or whether that's before you, that there's more basis for the requests than just the user group's demands.
I have trouble understanding how it costs $30,000 to create the underlying report that says, this is what was in our last master plan, here's what we've done since then. So maybe that could be cheaper and a little more money put towards, I mean, $30,000 to give a report that we did X, Y, and Z in the last 5 years seems something maybe could be done in-house. And the planning for the future should be where most of the money goes. Just a thought.
I think whatever we spend should be a source that the council's going to trust, because the worst thing we can do is get a report done by staff and be like, well, I know professionals that did this, and we beat up staff.
But it's, if it all it is a report of where we're at.
I agree with your point, and I wondered the same thing because I was part when that 5-year plan was done, and that was a pretty comprehensive plan. Maybe updating that can be more reasonable, and we can look at sources to do it, but what I'd really like to do is see the funding actually go to the department. If they don't spend it, it goes back into the budget.
And to be clear, there would be a scope of services that's issued through an RFP, and ultimately that contract would be before the Common Council for approval. So if you were dissatisfied with either the cost or the scope, then that could be amended as a part of that process.
And it did sound like one of their objectives was to be able to apply for grants, which most of the time you can't use an old 5-year-old plan to apply for a grant for a park.
No, I understand that, but you could update a plan for, if all you're doing is saying what we've done since, take the old plan and add the add-ons. I can't imagine that costs $30,000. If so, I want to change professions.
We don't know.
It's only slightly more. I mean, they have to look at national park standards, the change in population, the demands based on those statistics, because that is what the DNR requires in order for that to be an accepted study that then becomes eligible for the grants.
You will not get the private sector to get involved in these projects unless we have that. That's needed to go forward. And there are so many people in this community that are passionate about the parks. We've seen it at how many meetings now? Nobody else is coming for other issues. They're coming for the parks. These are things they want to use. These are things that they move here for with their families to utilize. And when the right people are involved, they raise a lot of money. And they're willing to put in a lot of their own money to do these things. So for us to put that 50,000, or like you said, it's not necessarily going to be 50,000. And if it doesn't get used, it's not used. But to do that, to allow them to get their funding that they need, to get their fundraisers or whatever they're doing to move forward, it's only a benefit to the city. They've provided how many countless amenities at these parks on their own without city money. And so it's a win-win all around.
They've put in more than the 50,000 that Parks is asking for in the last couple of years alone. I mean, and if you want to talk about the utilization of Lemke, I mean, if anyone knows utilization of Lemke, it's me. I mean, I was there for lacrosse. I coached lacrosse. I was on Field 5, which is the closest field to Donges Bay Road. My kids, when they had to go to the bathroom, had to run all the way down the road to the 1 to 2 portalets that are over by the playground.
If they ran to the portalets.
They ran to the
went to the
portalets.
woods.
My boys
I did
ran
it for, I was a coach for many years there for Cardinal. I mean,
my boys ran to the portalets because when I was first alderman, I had the soccer field and the lady was complaining they weren't using the portalets, so I made sure I was legit. And then now my son's, he's playing football in the same field, and again, they've got lights up, they've got like the most unbelievable program. I mean, I did not know how fabulous the Cardinal program was. I was a skinny little swimmer in high school, so I didn't play football, but watching the amount of kids in this program at one park, I mean, we talk about, our parks aren't utilized, we don't need to spend money on it. This park is heavily utilized. Weekend lacrosse tournaments, you can hardly find parking. Drop-off, pick-off, just alone for football, and people carpool, you can hardly find parking. These facility reports are needed. I'm going into a little bit of the granular level, but I'm really trying to tie into the feel that that park is being heavily used and underfunded. And we've got private investment groups asking to spend money there. These reports need to be done, they need to be accurate, they need to be able to do their fundraising as they're requesting to do, so that we can get a lot of these things put in. I'd like to see 100,000 put in seed money into parks as well, in addition to the 50. You know, I think some of these things are needed, and the city needs to, you know, show that they're not only going to build roads and brick and mortar buildings, but they're going to reinvest in, you know, what it means to be in a community. This is a family-friendly community, and you have to support the activities within the community and have the facilities there. You don't need an Olympic facility, but you should have more than 2 portalets a quarter mile away.
I completely agree with you. When Coach Keel comes here and talks about the impact of the youth sports in this community, he's been seeing it firsthand for so many years, how it translates all the way to that senior year level in high school. And not only that, but I've been involved with, I've had 9 straight years of Homestead football. And to see the kids that come back post-collegiately, that are coming back home to Mequon, and that a lot of those kids start in those youth sports that started at some of these fields when they didn't have some of those other amenities. And so to put into the youth, you can't go wrong. I mean, that's what's created. I mean, how many people have been here all their life? I mean, unfortunately, I haven't been, but I mean,
yeah,
you know, giving back to the community after all those years, and so I think it's really important that we help the Parks Department and help the people of this community utilize the things that they came here for or that they stay here for.
So 50.
Here's the proposed capital plan that we indicated to all of you in the memo that we were going to share with you. As you know, we're hot and heavy into budget development. We're in the throes of putting together the document that's going to be put out to all of you next week. And so this is a fluid planning process, and we wanted to be sure we were giving you the latest and best information relative to what we will be including in the budget next week.
Has there be any attempt in the budget? I mean, we've had 2 consultants who gave very detailed plans and recommendations, and the materials that we got tonight really don't track. They're very hard to look at what they're recommending and what you're recommending and see if they're consistent. They're different formats. There's no cross. There's no tie. There's no, you know, here's the facility, the building facilities recommendations, and here's what we're doing. Here's the fleet recommendations, and here's what we're doing. The amount of work, I mean, I spent a considerable amount of time trying to do that myself, and it's very difficult to do it. And for example, I see vehicles, you know, one of the 3 recommendations I see from this consultant is having one sinking fund, but we're not doing that. Maybe that's too quick because we're already through budget and we do that for next year. But it would be nice if there was a way to somehow
absolutely
track
and that
recommendations.
And that, Alderman Worth, is our plan long-term, is to pull this all together so it's coherent across all of the various asset classes. The challenge for staff is we've got a budget to put together as well, and the capital process starts, you know, back in late summer, or I'm sorry, late spring, early summer, and
that's why we wanted this earlier. But I mean, it kind of
did have a report from Public Works.
Yeah.
So.
But I want to draw the council's attention to one of the points Alderman Worth made, which is city facilities and repairs. And you'll notice we've got a fairly sizable amount of money budgeted for 2019 to start addressing that backlog of deferred maintenance that was identified in the EMG study. And this corresponds with a lot of the projects that Director Lundeen identified in her memo, which is also included in your packet. So if you remember that number that we talked about early on in the presentation, we are hitting that mark in 2019 relative to city facilities and repairs. Last year, we worked $350,000 into the operating budget without a tax increase for maintenance. So if you look across our major asset classes, roads and infrastructure, city facilities and repairs, all of a sudden, we're seeing some sizable dollar amounts that on a year-over-year basis are going to result in tangible resources that can be devoted to our long-term capital asset classes in these particular categories. Now, you'll see through the rest of the plan that we've got some fairly static numbers across Public Works fleet, police vehicles and equipment. We're seeing an increase there because we're already planning for the replacement of those SUVs in 2019, 2020, and we've got to put money away so that we can pay for that conversion when it needs to occur. The other notable item on this proposed capital plan, and you all will have a chance to discuss this at appropriations and ultimately decide where the dollars are going to go, Director Lundin is recommending that we take drainage money that typically we've budgeted the last several years at $40,000, take that down to a smaller number and increase the amount of money for emerald ash borer, because we are taking down 3,500 trees a year, and we need the benefit of having additional resources for contracted work for trees that we cannot get to with our crews, so that we can reduce that public liability and that public hazard associated with these trees. As the council will recall, we have 27,000 ash trees, 27,000 ash trees in public right-of-way and on public property here in the city of Mequon, and you just need to just take a drive up I-43 and look at the trees on the sides of both roads. Half of the trees don't have leaves on them right now, and that's indicative of what's going on in the area relative to our ash tree inventory. So we've got to be smart and strategic. This is an attempt to redeploy some of these resources into a more pressing need, and ultimately we'll get those monies back into that account long term. So all in, we're looking at about a $1.2 million expenditure for capital, pay-as-you-go capital proposed for 2019. The last several years, we've been clicking along in the mid-800s. So this represents another big jump relative to our capital spend over last year's.
Although we are putting, now that's road maintenance, there's no line item for road reconstruction. Is that correct?
Correct. This is pay-as-you-go capital as it relates to the operating budget. Within the CIP, there's a request for $1.8 million or $1.45 million over 3 years. And as was discussed at our July budget meeting workshop, the plan is to issue bonds next year to do a 3-year road project or a road program and to fund additional reconstruction.
That puts us another $1.5 million or $1.2 million behind. I mean, the city has since about 2004, I don't know, remember exactly where it was. There was a period where we were down in the early 2000s where we were down to this low of number. We then upped it so that we could increase our road maintenance and road improvement level in the PACER number. And we reduced it for last year, so we're going to skip 2 years. I'm just asking from the level that has been recommended. Isn't that correct? No? Do we have bond money left from the last bonding to do more roads?
I think if I understand your question, Alderman Worth, is the plan would be to borrow 4.5 next year and spend roughly a third of that in 19, 20, and 21.
Oh, in 19, okay. I was thinking
Right.
that was 420.
But the actual repayment wouldn't start until 2020.
Okay,
So
I just wanted to make sure there was more roads than that for 2019, because other than that, you're sliding backwards.
Yeah, we took a year off, and we're going to pick it back up again in 2019. And we've created some headroom relative to our debt levy in order to do that.
Right.
Additionally, with respect to capital, we are still waiting on our local road aid revenue number from the state. Many of you will recall last year during appropriations, we got that number after the draft budget went out, and much of the discussion at appropriations involved how we were going to spend that additional surplus in revenue that we weren't otherwise anticipating. We're still waiting on that number, and to the extent that any excess funds are realized over what Director Watson has budgeted, staff would recommend consideration of putting that into a self-funded account for road projects in the future, which would be non-debt financed road projects.
With regards to bike and pedestrians' request to have some level of funding, would that be going into roads, or would that be a separate line item? Because that's a paved surface, they're asking for paved items.
Ultimately, that's a decision for council to decide, but we will be coming forth.
You didn't answer
And
my
we may
question.
not know that until we have until after the draft budget is done.
What pocket does that come out of? Does it go in, would it be a council decision out of road budget, or would it be a council decision as a separate line item? And if it's not in road budget and it needs to be a separate line item, it's something to address at appropriations?
It would be something to address at appropriations, and much like we did last year, staff would come forward with a recommendation. It is ultimately up to the council to decide where that money would go. So it could be roads, it could be Emerald Ash Borer, it could be bike and pedestrian. As soon as we have those numbers.
It's a separate line item that's not included in the road borrowing of 4.5 or 5 million?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I want to make sure.
Additionally, as I think we just covered, we're planning a road borrowing of between $4.5 and $5 million for next year. That does not include an $800,000 grant that we've received for Cedarburg Road, which will be used next year, correct, Director Lundin, in connection with that project?
That's the intent. We need more staff, but that's the intent.
So Cedarburg Road is on the drawing board for next year. We've previously mentioned staff's desire to get the council together, maybe in the fourth quarter of this year or the first quarter of next year, to prioritize some public improvement projects within the town center taxing district. So we'll be looking to get that on the schedule once we're through the various budget exercises here this fall. And then we've got a couple of town center civic campus projects coming that have been laid over until 2019, including our parking lot out back and the Gateway Promenade, where fundraising is still underway, and they're kicking over construction until 2019. So a lot going on. That wraps it up for the CIP. Are there any questions regarding the capital improvement program documents included in the council's binder?
Just one observation, that was the Highland Road interchange. That's in there for $3.3 million. That's not likely to happen. And if it does, the county pays half of that. So it really doesn't cost, it wouldn't cost us $3.3 million. Just something to keep in your back of your head if we ever do see improvements to I-43.
I did think we had an agreement of how much we were willing to chip in for that was signed when it was a project a couple of years ago.
Correct. That was the 3.3, and then we subsequently entered into an MOU with the county such that they were going to split that cost with us.
Okay. Thanks for the
But
refresher.
that wouldn't allow for a three-party
By the
agreement.
time they actually do it'll probably be $60 million and we'll pay
It'll be a smaller percentage.
1.75.
That'll be the most brilliant
Yes.
negotiation
I think we
decision
ever
on
did, right?
council's
Right.
You're welcome.
shoulders ever. Yes, good job.
One other thing we've done in relation to tonight's meeting is have the department heads take a strategic look at some of the longer-term funding needs that they have within their operating budgets that we would like the council to at least be aware of over the next several years. I know the comment has been made in the past. We'd like to hear from the departments and hear what their needs are. It's very likely that most of the items that you saw within those memos and on the table that came behind those memos will not be in the draft operating budget that's presented to you next week. But we wanted to get those items in front of you rather than dropping that on you the night of appropriations, or for you to just be getting that as you're going into appropriations, and to have the opportunity to ask any of the department heads who penned those memos any questions that you might have relative to those options. So that's the last real concrete portion of tonight's meeting, and this chair is now vacant. If you have any interest in speaking with any of the department heads, if the information rests as is and it's clear to each of you, certainly there's no need to roll each of the department heads up here to talk about those items. Alderman Worth.
Well, I have a question on the police department funding. And what's in the memo makes sense to me. But I noticed there's a capital improvement proposal that's, I don't remember if it's for 2022 or 2023, for cameras on the corner of Mequon and Port Washington Road, which was, back in these pages here, which was something your predecessor had talked about for a couple of years, and I'm wondering whether the police department thinks of that as an important element also.
What page?
Well, it's actually not. It's written by. It's under technology, not necessarily written by the police department, but something the police. I know Steve Graff.
I haven't had the opportunity to look at that. I remember about 2 or 3 years ago we were looking into that. And it was a project that we were very interested in. And I don't have any current dollar figures in regards to it. We ran into some issues in regards to how to properly wire the intersection. There was questions in regards to obtaining power. There was also, if you remember, it was kind of a hot button in regards to helpers, storing data. This is certainly something we could look back into, but we'd need some current information.
I mean, when I listened to Steve Graff talk about it, it made perfect sense from not just accidents there, but also bad guys leaving town.
Solving crimes, yes. No, I was a big proponent of this.
And maybe it can't be in this year's budget, and you're probably not going to be sitting here 12 months from now. But I hope that it's something that we look at from a, moving, at least look at whether that's something appropriate to move up, because I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. I had the same page dog-eared in mine and had an arrow moving it to the left in time. Probably not for next year, but maybe we could give it another serious look sooner than 2023.
Because I think that it would probably, at least, I had heard in the past, it'd be helpful for your department.
It would be extremely helpful. It would help solve crime. It would reduce the time invested in these investigations as far as follow-up. So I'm all for the cameras at the intersection. There's a question.
I'm hoping it's something we can look at, again, sooner than 2023, and maybe it can't make this budget, but it could be discussed this next year. So I didn't really have a question about your memo. Your memo made sense, but I wanted to raise that issue.
Any other questions for anybody? Alderman.
Just back to the sick details, is it possible to have it forecast out for fiscal years 19 through 2023? Is it possible to see some of the historical data that's been for those line items?
That's not part of the software, that's part of this package, but we could probably produce something to compile something.
Can't hear you, Tom.
It's not part of the software package that's that we're using on this, but we could compile something like that if that's what the council wants.
I'm curious because there's some line items in here that I don't recall actually being line items previously. So it's just kind of get a base. If it's a huge change, it's consistency year over year. Give a sense on some of the items.
Okay. Alderman Worth?
Well, I had another question regarding community development, but I thank you, Chief. Actually, it was on inspections. Well, I had a little trouble with the memo because it says you averaged 3,864 permits with revenues of $10,000,004. I'm assuming that's
an error. I apologize.
it got missed as we were going through the process. Our revenue for the 2013 to 2017 is $4.134 million. So it's about $1.1 million more than the 2000 to 2004.
Your permit revenue is $4 million a year?
No, over that 5-year period.
Okay, over the 5-year period.
Right, so we're averaging right around $826,000 a year the last 5 years.
And how much do we spend a year on inspections?
About half.
About $364,000.
I mean, our goal with fees has always been to have fees be, you know, covering the cost of the item, not to being a supplement to the other departments for services rendered. But, you know, just as a revenue source. I'm sorry, I got such a terrible cold. And if we're, you know, the complaint we get constantly is the amount of time it takes to get inspections done, to get plans reviewed, the fact that plans are being shipped to the state that, you know, used to be done by the department here. And it seems to me that if we're bringing in almost twice as much money for our permits than we're spending, we ought to up our service that's rendered. So, you know, that money shouldn't just be a slush fund for the rest of the budget.
I don't know why they're asking for.
I think it's absorbed in the department. I mean,
what?
I don't know if, to do the inspections, you use about half of it, but the department overhead, just to run the department, is significantly more than the amount.
The amount of the expenses at averaging about $364,000 is typically our salaries, our training, our equipment. The only thing that would not be included in that would be the housing of City Hall, our cars, because DPW covers that for us.
So for like other expenses, we do add an overhead factor on when we determine permit costs, but it's not twice that.
Yeah.
No. Last year it was $918,000 in fees collected with a $416,000 in expenses departmental without overhead.
But if you added an overhead factor, Tom, what is the percentage of the overhead factor when we're using the calculation roughly?
Well, part of that overhead, our overhead factor includes fringe benefits, so
Right.
that's already included in the numbers they've just provided. So we're going to talk about
But we also had a
building
factor
and things
for,
like that, maybe 20, 25%.
so we're collecting far more than inspections are costing us, and yet we're shortchanging the amount of inspections we're having done, so that somebody in moving a wall it can take weeks to get somebody to look at the plans and approve the plans. It sounds like we're taxing one group of taxpayers to you know, for the benefit of others, and that's not the purpose behind fees. That's the purpose behind general taxation.
But that's why we should be funding their request,
Well,
which
that's
is that
why
they need more staff.
That's why I brought them up and think that we should be, you know, I wanted to make the point that, you know, the request for the inspections department is one we ought to take seriously. And then my guess is it's not going to be in the draft budget that's coming ahead before us. And that's probably inappropriate. So that's why it's more to lay out what you just said.
I further support funding that staff person.
Or we should be reducing the amount that we're collecting on fees if we're not giving the service.
Well, we're not giving the service, we're not keeping up. And I'm hearing things from developers in the city that, you know, I mean.
I see it every day. I mean, I actually agree with John on something. Yay.
Why do you do on the park?
It's incredible.
But no, I see it every day. I've actually dealt with it. I mean,
Feels good to be
I hate
agreeable,
this.
doesn't
I
it?
mean, I really don't want to say it, and I don't mean to be mean, but we're the worst at issuing permits. We are the worst. It's all I hear from other contractors that I deal with. I can go to New Berlin and get a permit like that. I can go to Menominee Falls and get a permit like that. I come here, I got to wait 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It's terrible, just terrible. So I mean, increasing staff is just needed.
agree with the point, but I think it still creates a $71,000 problem somewhere else in the budget that we'll have to deal with.
Except that that's $71,000 that people are paying for.
Oh, I agree.
Already.
I agree with the philosophy. They should be able to self-fund it, but right now those monies go into the general fund when it's all done, right?
Correct.
That's
So,
that's like
still gonna
borrowing
create a-
Social Security to pay to pay general operating funds. It's wrong.
Still gonna create a $71,000 problem we get fixed elsewhere.
That'd be a subject for our appropriations.
Yep.
What?
Are you recognizing me?
No, I know he keeps waving his hand. I don't recognize anybody. He's the
Do you
chair.
feel recognized?
You gotta wear a Waldo hat. Where's Waldo?
There's no question that community development and the inspections division in particular has been running hard the last several years. We're seeing high volume at the counter, and the numbers speak for themselves. One point I want to make so that the members of the committee understand when you get the draft budget next week. As we were going through the departmental budget meetings with each of the operating departments, we reviewed personnel and we reviewed staffing. And I will tell you that Mr. Zader and Mr. Launer and Ms. Tollefson indicated to me that if they had to make a choice between an inspector position and a permit coordinator position, they felt the inspector position would be a higher priority. And we have taken a part-time inspection position, the electrical inspector, the part-time electrical inspector position, and we've made that into a full-time position, and that is in the draft budget that you will see next week. So I'm not trying to speak at cross purposes to my colleagues here to my right, but I want you to understand efforts have been made at my level and at the finance department's level to recognize that there's a need there and to apply additional staffing resources in support of this department. So I don't want the council to get out ahead of yourselves and be authorizing 2 additional positions in community development without having yet seen the draft budget.
But does that solve your problem, Paul?
No.
I mean, people are paying for those services. We need to be rendering those services in a timely manner.
All of the items that you've seen on the list that came from all of the departments, I support every one of those requests. And I see a need across all of the departments for everything contained on those lists. So I am not going to personally object to putting more money into the budget to fund this position, because I see the need as well. My office is right next to the community development counter. I see it every day. But to the point that was made, I think, by Alderman Nurbin, we have a draft budget that's coming together quickly here, and if we're going to put something in, something else is going to have to come out if we're going to meet the council's directive to bring you a 0 tax rate increase budget. So it's a zero-sum game, and something may have to give or something may have to go up.
Let's also remember, too, that the permit situation in that is not an anomaly, but it's a direct reflection of the economy right now. And in 5-6 years from now, where that may not be that same situation.
And then you reduce it like we did before.
What?
And then you reduce, you get rid of somebody like we did
So then you
8 years ago.
5 years and you get rid of them because.
If it goes down.
That's what we've done historically. Back in 2000, we've had 6 staff members in inspections. Now we're down to 4.5. We actually dropped down to 3.5 at one point when we were at the lowest point of the recession in 2009, 2010. And every year we've grown with revenues. And every year we have had 1 year in 2009 where we did not actually have a surplus budget out of the inspections division.
I mean, the customer service thing's not something new. This has been going on for a long time, that contractors have been dissatisfied with the timely manner, not just contractors, but homeowners as well. I mean, I'm trying to remember back when I built the Vietnamese noodle, it was terrible, the amount of time we had to wait to get work and to get inspections done. It's not something new. This has been going on a long time. So we really need to increase staff there if they need it.
I agree. And if you look at the chart that was included at the back end of the memos, I think the conversion factor, 1 penny on the tax rate is equivalent to $46,000 worth of new spending I think the position being discussed here is probably equivalent to about a penny and a half on the tax rate, just to put that into perspective. The good news is you don't have to make a decision tonight. What we wanted to do as part of this workshop meeting was to get these thoughts and these observations and these recommendations from the subject matter experts in front of you so that you can think about them. To the extent that you need additional information, we're certainly available between now and when the budget goes out, and then even after the budget goes out, before you reconvene as an appropriations committee. So there's time for discussion, there's time for to think about this, and ultimately you all will decide in what direction we're going to go for 2019.
I have another question. Are we done with this section, the development? No. Yes. My question has to do with the fire department. If we think back to last year, we were, the chief was looking for a deputy, and we had some spare money, and we decided to fund temporarily that position for the rest of the year. This position, to my knowledge, has never been filled, partly because the Police and Fire Commission has been having to work with a lot of turnover in the police department as well. So I just wanted just a couple sentence update on that. Is that position now funded still, this deputy chief position that we temporarily funded last year but was never filled, or what is going on with that?
Partially funded.
Yeah, partially funded.
Just put ads.
Because it was for a half year.
Yeah, it was a half year.
That is another position that has been fully funded for 2019.
Okay, that was my question mainly. So the deputy chief is fully funded?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
They just went out they just advertised for it.
Okay.
So it started.
Okay.
Finally. I mean, it was supposed to get started how long ago?
A year.
Right.
Back in March.
And it just keeps getting put off in every Fire and Police Commission meeting, and then it's not taken up. And so it really I mean, we can't just, because we're doing something in the police department, we can't just neglect the fire department. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, people need to multitask.
We
and
don't
need to deal with other
have any control
issues.
over those folks, though, as to my knowledge.
Yeah, we have no control over them, unfortunately.
It would be nice to have it done. I think the fire department's been underfunded for years. I mean, definitely I want to see this as a line item on budget, that if we would choose to add it in, if it's not in the budget, this would be, one of the high priority items as well, just, as we do some budget additions and subtractions, at that meeting, and this would be a good point to make sure that it's listed in there.
Well, it is funded.
Well, it will be.
Yeah.
It's funded
Right.
in the
That one position.
But he's asking for additional.
additional positions.
He's asking for additional interns from 3 to 6. I mean,
Right.
it's an intern. I mean, the guy's running a whole department on a shoestring.
When you look at other communities that are comparable.
He's crushing it. I mean, you want to talk about an achiever, this guy's pretty much it. If he needs a couple interns, great, run with it.
I'd like to hear some of the details behind it. We've got said in the last 3 months, we've had 470 hours of unfilled EMS positions. How would the pieces of the puzzle laid out here help address that? I mean, this some quick math, that's roughly 20% of the time over the last 3 months, we've had a shortfall in staffing.
Well, as you know, a paid-on-call department is, I've always used the word fragile, but I come up with a new word now, and it's a house of cards. And we're just, somebody's changed a job, a sick wife, a sick child, a sick spouse, or change a job just to make the whole thing come down. And in the summer, especially in the summer, it's tough to find people to fill those hours. The additional shift commanders, or to do other positions, is fulfilling the staffing study recommendation we did in 2017. So those shift commanders would be there to supplement those hours where we can't find people. And to the point you had with that underfunded, if you take a look at that, I implore you to take a look at that chart of other communities that are similarly situated as to Mequon. And when I look at that chart, it tells me one of 4 things. One is that they're either zipping their taxpayers and they're bleeding them for something they don't need. They're either, that's one. 2 is they're funding the departments appropriately so they can accomplish all the mission critical tasks that they need. 3, I'm the greatest fire chief in the history of Wisconsin. With nothing of my hard work and good looks and charm, we get by. Or 4, we're underfunding our operation. And if it's 3, I want a really big pay raise.
And a cape.
Yeah.
Because of your good work.
Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned.
Good meeting, guys.
Will, should have asked the police chief one more question. So, and I'll probably ask him, but I'm guessing he's had this discussion. The impound facility on a temporary basis.
Oh, I can. Yeah, I've got